Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Today I'm going to show you how I'm making my E90 BMW more reliable. Alright, let's get this unboxed. We have a long hose. We have a coolant level sensor. We have a level sensor extension. We have a brand new rad cap. We have an adapter piece, long silicone hose. We have a grommet, some hose managers, mounting hardware, and some hose clamps. And that seems to be everything that's referenced in this kit here. So I've had this car for 6 years. It has 200,000 miles. I'm sure this isn't the original coolant expansion tank, but I've never replaced it on this car. I feel like I'm well overdue for it to fail. If you guys weren't aware, this is plastic and there's two pieces that are glued together. You have this lid in the lower body, and then right around here, because of the heat of the turbos, it will split and spray coolant everywhere. So I feel like this is a definite weak spot on these cars, and it's one of the major ways your BMW can have a coolant issue and can lead to major problems. So that's where this comes in. This is an aluminum expansion tank made by Turner Motorsports. As you can see, we're going to be removing the coolant bottle from over here and relocating it over here. So I feel as though it's just going to clean things up a little bit, but also be dead reliable. So this will just avoid a future failure. These aren't expensive, but when they fail, you're going to want to get an OEM one and not an aftermarket one. And once you spend that type of money, something like this could make sense. Especially if I go single turbo anyway in the future, I'll be ready. This came out a couple of years ago and it looks really nice. And if you guys have been following my channel, you know that I'm getting rid of known failure points that are plastic and upgrading to aluminum wherever possible. And that's where this comes in. And it's a complete kit. It's a little pricey. It comes in at 500 and change. I'll put a link in the description if you guys are interested. Overall, it accomplishes a lot. It's not just changing this, but it's moving it out of the way. So we're going to be following their install guide. Going to be removing the intake snorkel, two T20s. If your car is otherwise stock, you'd have this hose clipped in at the top here, but I've already replaced this. I'm going to remove the electrical connector for the radiator fan. We'll disconnect this and get this out of the way. Now it's time to get the car jacked up. I'm going to remove the belly pan. One of the steps is to get the fan shroud out, so I'm taking out this bolt here that holds the transcooler to the fan shroud. This car used to be auto, so it still has this in place. It was raining pretty heavily, so some water trapped in a few areas. I'm going to go ahead and take that out from the top right now, actually. So in terms of draining enough coolant so that it doesn't make a big mess up at the coolant bottle, I'm going to pop off the lower rad hose right now. Reach up from the top, disconnect that, and then let it drain into my drain bucket below. So you can see it draining there. You don't necessarily have to go much further than when the coolant bottle empties itself and it's completely empty. But I'm just going to the point where it mostly stops, and then we'll click the hose back on and proceed. But my coolant bottle is definitely completely empty at this point. Pretty much at the point where I can stick that right back on and move on to the next step. For whatever reason, one of the next steps was to remove the charge pipe going to the throttle body. I'm not sure that's necessary, but we'll see. We'll get there. I'm going to disconnect these hoses off the expansion tank. So the vacuum canister hoses have to come off the expansion tank. Using a pick tool, remove this hose here. Set it aside. You have two 10 mils here. Lift up on the expansion tank. There's a hose at the bottom that we have to remove. I may not be able to pull this all the way up until I disconnect that. Then we can pull up on the tank and disconnect the level sensor plug. And this was the hose I was going after at the bottom. So this will be a tough shot, but right there is the hose that clicks onto the front of the thermostat housing, and the hose that goes up to the bottom of the existing expansion tank leads to there. Depending on your production date, you may have a clamp that you can unscrew, or you may have to cut it off. In my case, I'll have to cut it off. So I'm going to disconnect that from the thermostat housing and then try to pull the hose down far enough to be able to cut that off. So I thought I had drained enough for that to go smoothly, but of course I didn't. So now, do I have enough slack to work with this? Let's see. I say I do. So here's a line. Let's click this in so we don't lose it. So I'm pulling this all the way down. This is the hose that led up to the bottom of the cooling expansion tank. So this is the clamp that needs to be cut. So I got that off. It was a bit of a pain, but we're ready to move on now. Now I'm bringing over the included hose. So I'm using this supplied clip-on hose holder. I opted to remove the lower rad hose so I can slide that on a little easier and screw it into place, but you can see that line going into that fitting that we removed the other hose from. And it just goes along the bottom, which will click into place. I'll go ahead and put that hose clamp on that. So there you can see everything clicked back into place. I put the lower rad hose back. I had removed that hose over there. That is the new hose that we just installed, and it just tucks in front of the lower rad hose going to the block. But overall, it looks clean when you're done. So next up, we got to remove the power steering reservoir out of the way. We have to take this bracket out of the way. There's a 10 mil over here. So the instructions did call for the removal of the charge pipe all the way down to the intercooler outlet. And I'm thinking that's so that you can get access to these bolts, but I'm gonna try to avoid that. Let's see how far we get with that. If possible, I'll try to get this bracket out of the way and see if we can skip that step, and I'll let you know. And that's based on having an aftermarket charge pipe, aftermarket intercooler pipe, etc. As you can see, I was able to create the slack I needed to get on that second 10 mil nut. And there's the other one that I went after first. There was easy access to that. This hose just lifts up and out of that plastic thing that clips down there. Now I'm just gonna lift up on this bracket. It says to remove it completely from the car. Now I have to use this hole here to insert the supplied grommet. I believe if you had a diesel car or like an M3, that hole would be used to hold the coolant bottle on this side anyway. So on the coolant bottle, you're supposed to screw this in here. So that's an 11 mil. Now I'm gonna attempt to bring this into place. Next up, they want you to harvest this 90-degree fitting from your old hose. This hose here will mate to that. So I'm gonna do that off camera, and I'll come back once I've taken this apart. Here's the elbow harvested. So you'll have to be careful with your routing. Think about it potentially contacting pulleys, etc. But once you're comfortable with the overall length, then you will trim it, screw this onto it, and then click it into place. So it wouldn't be the end of the world if you somehow cut this too short because you got it wrong, because you could just get a simple coupler, but of course, triple check before you cut. So to be sure, I'm gonna put the upper rad hose back in. So before anything, I should probably make sure that I mount this. Looks like it goes over here now before I touch this. It's almost as if you have to get this on into place first before you can bring this over. But I just want to get an idea of if it's going to reach or if there's going to be any problems. I'm plugging in the extension harness that came with the kit for the level sensor. So that transfer hose that normally runs over here has clips for it. I just routed that harness in those clips for management purposes. And we'll just plug it in over here. So I have an active steering reservoir because I have active steering, and this is interfering. I don't know if this bracket looks any different on a standard car, but I have to break this off or get rid of it. This normally goes into a grommet to stabilize the bottle, which isn't going to be there anyway, and this would interfere with where the hose clicks onto the coolant bottle. So I plan to just basically bend this until it breaks off because it's a brittle, hard metal. If you find your car is the same, you may need to do the same, but it cleanly breaks. I'm using the supplied hardware for the bracket. These are 4 mil Allens. So those hoses that feed from the reservoir have no problem coming to this direction. They're not kinked and they look like they're in their natural position. So if you have your original line here, you may actually have to cut a clamp off as well to be able to insert this hose on here. But if this is the original upper rad hose or it's very old and it looks like it's brown, be prepared for it to potentially break and you may want to have another upper rad hose on hand. But we're essentially taking this piece, clipping it onto the reservoir and clamping it onto there. I ran into an issue with this pipe. I wasn't able to click it on no matter how hard I tried. It was almost as if the fitting was a little bit too long and it was hitting the end of this elbow before it could click on. But I used my original hose, I'll show you. So this fitting fits on perfectly and it's a little more robust looking and solid. So you guys will have this on your car as well. So really it can easily bend here. It's not kinked in any way and it can reach there and it will look natural and seem fine. So I'm gonna go this route. You guys will be able to do the same thing because this pipe comes on your car already and it comes apart like this. Another thing I noticed is even if that was sitting on there but not fully clicked in, it didn't naturally want to reach here without it being under some strain or stretched a little bit. So I wasn't a fan of that anyway. So I'm going to set this aside and use my original hose, which should make a difference. And that's what we ended up with. Looks completely fine and it's not stretched. It's a good length. So that would be the piece that goes from the top of your original coolant reservoir to about here on the car. Next up is a small nipple over here for overflow. They want you to take this, route it through the hole below your shock tower and to the wheel well area, and you can zip tie it to a brake line. That would just be if there's excess pressure and it needs to vent somewhere, it will vent out of here. So you're supposed to cut off one of these fat ends because it's too big for this. You cut this off, make it smaller, use a small clamp, and then the other end you can leave open and cut to length. That's what I'm talking about, where it's a little bit fat on the end. So I followed the advice of the instructions and passed that through. Coming through that hole over there, and I'm just gonna zip tie it to this brake line here. Cut it a bit short so that if it ever has to overflow, it just drip onto the ground beside the tire. So that's how that turned out. I'm gonna move on to final assembly now. If you guys are wondering, there's a little tiny hole here, and when the maximum pressure of this cap is reached, it'll bypass and push coolant out of there, but otherwise no coolant would ever come out of there. Not sure if you can hear that, but it's bleeding itself really well, just without the natural bleed procedure. You can hear all the air bubbles coming to the top. I'll initiate the electronic bleed procedure, which I've explained on many occasions, where you put the temperature all the way up, put the fan speed to 1, and for the gas pedal for 10 seconds. Seems to bleed just fine on this side as it would on that side with the electronic bleed procedure. Alright guys, the bleed procedure is done. You'll know it's fully bled when you're just above that Turner plate there. Alright, there's a final look at the end result. I really like how it cleans up the engine bay. I think it looks pretty good. And I like how it opens up the side of the engine bay, given there's a lot of heat in that area. We'll be ready for single turbo when the day comes. But overall, it just looks cleaner in my opinion. Could have come this way from the factory. Alright guys, that'll conclude this video showing you how to upgrade your coolant expansion tank to aluminum. You could be doing it for reliability purposes, or for aesthetic purposes, or for clearance purposes if you're going single turbo. But either way, I think it's a worthy upgrade for this car. If this is the first video you're catching of mine, please consider subscribing. If you liked the video, please give it a like so I'll rank higher. Thanks for watching.